So now we talked about mindset and planning. We'll talk about exercise programming and how to create something that's a little bit more specific to you and your goals. So let's jump in. So when you're starting any kind of program, it starts with your goal. Once we figure out what we're trying to accomplish, we can look at creating a program based off of that. And we can start by looking or creating a spectrum. So I drew this out, and when we're figuring out what we want to accomplish, whether it is fat loss or strength gains or trying to improve speed or agility or anything like that, we'll start by looking at the different variables that exercise provides us. So when we're looking at more of a metabolic response, that's usually something that's a little bit at 15 or more repetitions, right? The more your muscles are working or contracting, the more metabolically demanding that it is. Then we have something that's all the way at the end of the spectrum, which is usually something that's like maybe 1 to 2 repetitions. And this is something that is a little bit more taxing on your central nervous system. And over here would be more metabolic. So in the middle, that's where that traditional like strength training program comes into play. But there's a few different ways that we can look at that. There's something that's a little bit more like a functional hypertrophy aspect, where you'd have something that's like about 12 to 8 repetitions. And this would be something that's a little bit more functional. So if we're trying to gain like size, if we're trying to become more of like a bodybuilder type of guy, or maybe just fill out or tone, I know a lot of people want to increase tone, then doing something that's a little bit more of a functional hypertrophy range with that 8 to 12 repetition may be something that we're trying to accomplish, or something that we should visit. Now we have something that's more of a structural component, or sometimes it's called a structural hypertrophy. And that would be something that's like 8 to 6 repetitions. And this would be more that absolute strength gain that we're trying to get, or if we're just trying to increase raw strength, this would be something that we're trying to accomplish there. Good to go? 1, 2, 3. So now that we have this, we also want to look at exercises that are more aerobic and more anaerobic. So something that is that's more repetition or a long endurance is going to be aerobic. It requires more oxygen, and that's going to be more at this metabolic response here. Now, if we're looking at something that is anaerobic, something that's usually shorter, quick burst, maybe like a sprint, or something that is only 1 to 2 repetitions, that does not require as much oxygen. So that's going to be more anaerobic, and that's going to be a little bit more at this end of the spectrum. So now that we have this is our like basic small blueprint of exercise programming and kind of our guide. So if we're trying to lose weight, lose fat, if we're trying to increase our strength or anything like that, we need to kind of understand these variables here. So for fat loss or anything, something that requires more oxygen is going to also help with fat oxidation that just requires oxygen. So looking at a metabolic program or something that's a little bit more functional or functional hypertrophy is going to be your best bet when it comes to a more repetition program. If you're looking at just increasing raw strength, or if you're looking at increasing your speed or anything, something that is more of a structural hypertrophy or something that is more demanding on your central nervous system is going to be your best bet. Usually for aerobic or anaerobic, sometimes that's you looked at long running or your sprints. So the same thing, sprints are going to be more demanding on the central nervous system, while aerobic, like a jog or something like that, is going to be more, it's going to fit more into that category. This is not to say that we shouldn't visit all the other spectrums or ends of the spectrums here, or different areas of the spectrum. We definitely want to visit all of these. The only big thing is determining how often or how long we're going to be in them. So if we're focusing on a weight loss program, or if we're focusing on a fat loss program, then we're probably going to end up putting more emphasis on something that's a little bit more metabolically demanding, and that's great. But because the body is so good at adapting to stuff and to the stressors that we put on it, it's going to be really, really good and efficient at doing metabolic training. So after we get the body to adapt to that, we have to change it up a little bit, so we can focus on maybe more at the other end of the spectrum, a strength training protocol, and then that could be for a few weeks. Then we can just go right back to your metabolic training, so that you get that same metabolic response, right? So it can help you continue to lose fat or anything like that. Vice versa, same thing. If you're trying to increase strength, you'll probably end up putting more emphasis on a strength training protocol, on something that may be a little bit more demanding on your central nervous system, or something that's a little bit more structurally demanding. But you'll do that at a longer period of time, and your body will adapt to that. And once it does, then we'll go visit a more metabolic response just for a few weeks, and then we can go back to what your primary focus is, depending on what your goal is. So the other thing we have to talk about is the breaks that are distributed throughout the spectrum. So for the most part, when you're at the more of a metabolic response program, the breaks tend to be shorter, and that's usually just because that the muscles don't need as much time to recover. They just need oxygen and blood, and they're good to go. So that it's longer time. It doesn't need as much time to recover. But once you get to the other end of the spectrum, something that's a little bit more intense due to weight or the quick bursts or anything like that, your breaks tend to be much longer. And that's because it just takes longer for your central nervous system to recover from that intense burst or that intense weight that you're lifting. So we want to keep that in mind, because I know that especially with all this high intensity stuff that's out there, doing sprints all the time or anything like that, it's almost like a recipe for disaster. When we're trying to combine something that is very demanding on the central nervous system and something that is more metabolically demanding. So if we're trying to combine sprints, which is more demanding on the central nervous system, because we can't maintain a sprint for more than 30 seconds or anything, so we're trying to do 100% effort, and that's usually going to be maybe 30 seconds, 20 seconds. We want to make sure that we can have that a good break to recover, so that we can do that sprint again and deliver max effort. When we're trying to cut the breaks really short so that we can try to promote a metabolic response, over time that ends up messing up your central nervous system and overtaxing your nervous system, and that's when injuries can happen, or maybe plateaus on weight loss or anything like that. So you may end up getting a good response in the beginning, but over time, bad things can happen, like injuries or anything like that. So making sure that we keep these almost like our spectrum in check, or keeping it balanced, is not only going to protect us, but also help us get the results that we want and keep them for the long term. So that was a lot of information, and just to recap it a little bit, depending on what your goals are is where you're going to end up laying on the spectrum. If you're looking to lose weight, you're looking to lose fat, then focusing on a metabolic program is going to be your best bet, most likely. And you can do that for maybe 1 or 2 months, and then after that you can focus on a more strength training program, and you can do that for a few weeks or a month, and then you go right back to what you're primarily focusing on. And that'll be vice versa depending on what your goals are. But you can also do it a little bit differently. You can say, I'll have 3 metabolic sessions a week, and then I'll have maybe 1 or 2 strength training sessions a week. So just depending on what you're trying to focus on or what your goals are is how you can lay that out. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. It just depends on which one that you prefer and which one you enjoy the most. So that's our exercise blueprint. These are some of the things that we want to consider when we're trying to create an exercise program. So you can look at our spectrum and visit it whenever you have any questions or if you're confused on anything, and see if you're fitting that spectrum when you're exercising. The next videos would be on exercise selection and variables. So leave a comment, let us know what your goals are and where you stand in the spectrum. This way we can create more videos for what you need. If you have any other questions or concerns, you can leave me a comment or email me.